welcome to the Working on Wellbeing podcast by the World Wellbeing Movement. The podcast that allows you to be a fly on the wall during conversations with the world's leading wellbeing experts. I'm your host, Sarah Cunningham, and today I'm joined by two trailblazing leaders who are setting new standards when it comes to workplace well-being and human connection. But before I introduce today's guests, I just want to say a word of thanks to our series sponsor, S&P Global. The world's leading organisations rely on S&P Global for the essential intelligence they need to make confident decisions. S&P Global, powering global markets. Now, I could not be more excited to welcome today's guests. First of all, we have KeyAnna Schmiedl, who is the Chief Human Experience Officer in Workhuman. And I just love that you have the word human in both your job title and your company name. I think that's awesome. So it's going to come as no surprise to our listeners that you are one of the world's leading voices on how to leverage human connection, build belonging, and leverage recognition to improve workplace well-being. So, KeyAnna, you are so welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation.
Well, I'm really excited to jump in. And joining you, we have someone who many of our listeners may be familiar with. Jen Fisher is renowned for her work into workplace well-being. Jen is an author. She is a TED Talk speaker. She is a podcast host. And she's very often credited with perhaps being the first Chief Wellbeing Officer. And if not the first, certainly the person who shaped and defined this really important role. So Jen, you are so welcome.
Thanks for having me. Super excited for this conversation.
Oh, brilliant. Well, look, let's jump in. I always like to start by getting to know the real person, getting to know my guests properly. So I'm going to start with you, KeyAnna. Thinking about your career journey, the work you do is so important, whether it's advancing diversity, inclusion, equity and belonging, human connection, recognition. Was there a defining moment in your life or in your career that led you to this career path?
You know, I'll give you one of each, maybe a life and a career answer. So for me, I'm a Black woman having grown up in the United States. And so about sixth grade or so, I realized in having a contentious back and forth with my teacher about whether I looked like the twin of a Black girl in one of our textbooks. I said I didn't, and he insisted that I did, and also insisted that I was being difficult. That I realized there was just this idea around me, not as a person, but me as a box of, defining characteristics that people would start to label before they even really knew who I was or maybe why I was arguing them. And so it stuck with me from that point throughout all of my schooling that not everybody immediately has this sense of belonging and this sense of belonging that really helps them to feel like they can challenge, they can learn, they can grow. And what does that do in a learning environment? But what does that do out in the world? And what does that do for how you show up and how you're developing as a person, as a young adult into an adult? And so the workplace one is, it's a very similar experience. One of my first opportunities in a role where I had my first big desk job, in my early 20s, and I thought I've made it. And I realized that the folks around me did not expect me to know much. One, because of what I looked like, but two, because of my background, socioeconomic status. I didn't come from a high pedigreed school. But then I realized I could use that to my advantage. It meant that I could ask questions unjudged because people didn't expect me to know anything. But that also meant that they were underestimating what I could do with the information. And they always tended to give me more information than I needed. And I was able to use that to prove to them that I'm more than what they thought. And so I think realizing in my own personal career journey that there are a lot of people who, for whatever reason, don't feel like they naturally fit some sort of mold that has been deemed successful or worthy of investment, and all of the ways that that impacts them holistically, was just this drive to say, we have to be able to appreciate and truly understand, what is that idea of culture add? What is this idea of what it means to bring your true self to work? And what do you really get when you unleash this sense of I belong here throughout your entire organization and all of its people? And that's really kind of what has driven me through my very winding career, and led me to where I am today at Workhuman.
KeyAnna, first of all, thank you so much for sharing so openly. And I think it's really important that our listeners hear that experience. There will be listeners who are battling with that right now, who are battling with that feeling that they don't belong in their workplace, in, you know, their university. What would be your advice for those listeners?
I would tell them to really think about what it is you're looking to get out of that experience, and then to identify, maybe it's with a friendly person, right? A mentor or somebody who has confidence in you, even though nobody else does. Identify what is that thing that is your superpower that nobody else is bringing to the conversation, to the discussion, to the space, and push yourself as hard as you can to really steer into that and not stay clear of it, because that's the thing that is really going to help people to identify you as somebody they should pay attention to, you as someone that they should invest in, because you're standing out and not just, a yellow poppy amongst a sea of yellow poppies. And so it's one of the most uncomfortable things to do. So I don't say this as, and it's really easy and you can start tomorrow, but I think it's just spending that time to identify what it is about yourself that you have to offer that you wish other people understood and could see, and then partner with somebody who you trust, who makes you feel safe, and who will push you to be brave in order to really show up in that way unabashedly as often as you can, making space for yourself, of course, because it isn't easy to do, because it takes a toll. But eventually you'll start to identify those people who see you in the way that you want to be seen. And once you identify one group, it's really easy to then move into different spaces and quickly see the people who are going to see you that way. And it makes it a bit easier to navigate no matter what space you're in.
Thank you so much. And it's such superb advice. I think a lot of us, when we're growing up, particularly perhaps women, are sort of told, don't be too big for your boots. Nobody likes a bragger. And so we end up focusing on our weaknesses and, oh, I must be better at this and I must be better at that. And there's such value in focusing on our strengths and being aware that we all have strengths. And to your word, we all have a superpower, maybe two. So I would urge our listeners to think about their superpower. And Jen, I'm going to go to you. And before I ask for your defining moment, can you give me your superpower?
I was going to say, I don't think I have any superpower. No, I'm just kidding. I think that I have a couple of superpowers. Vulnerability is definitely one of my superpowers. It weirdly, I think, comes to me very easily in terms of how I show up in the world. And so people regularly ask me, what's it like to be so vulnerable? And I think it comes naturally to me, although I will say the first time I was very open, and by very open, I mean in a Harvard Business Review article about my mental health struggles. So it kind of doesn't get more open than that. I did have a freak out moment of, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And can we take this down? Can we pull it back? But I think when I'm vulnerable and when I show up vulnerable, it invites other people to do the same. And I have gotten nothing but, kind of, if we're looking for external validation, kind of this external validation of, thank you for showing up in this way. So I would pick vulnerability perhaps as my top superpower.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to go back to you, but KeyAnna, I do want to know your superpower because I haven't asked it yet. I suspect you have more than one.
Well, since Jen took my, no, I'm kidding. I would
You
say
can be
that my,
vulnerable too.
no, Jen, no, I can't. I would say that my superpower is authenticity. I think it's born out of, the feedback that you get all the time of your emotions are written on your face, or, my mom's favorite phrase to me, which is fix your face. And I'm like, I can't. I really just can't. And so I think, leaning into that as a strength of mine of like actually calling out and saying, I am certain that my face right now is betraying a neutral stance. And so let me share with you what's going on in my head. I think people appreciate it, right? In the same way that Jen was talking about vulnerability. I was joking before that I can't say vulnerable, but I think, humility, vulnerability, authenticity, transparency, all of those things kind of go together. And whichever one comes first, it sort of pulls the rest of them along. And so, there is no way to be authentic without also being vulnerable, in my opinion, at least. And I think it's a beautiful combination that we're seeing in a lot more leaders now, and a lot more new leaders who are just standing up and saying there is a different definition of leadership. And whether or not I'm helping to define it, I at least want to make space for it to be seen differently.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I might actually build empathy into that, because I think, I suspect the three of us are kindred spirits, and listeners will know that I've also been sort of vulnerable with my own mental health challenges. But one thing, as a child, I was always told, oh, you're too sensitive. But actually, I'm quite empathetic. And I think that's really helped me to be a good friend, to be a good wife, a good daughter, a good sister, a good aunt, a good colleague. Is just trying to put myself in other people's shoes, and understand. But Jen, speaking of empathy, you've been really open and really vulnerable with your story. And it's something that I know a lot of people really, really appreciate. But I believe it also was your, I suppose you speak about burnout, and I'll get you to talk to us about that in a minute, but that actually led you to all of the incredible work you've done since. Do you want to share that, please?
Yeah, and as we're all talking, I'm just thinking in our strengths lie our weaknesses too, right? So, so absolutely. I mean, I think, on the topic of empathy, Sarah, you and I have regularly spoke about how important it is to be empathetic, but how it can also get us in trouble sometimes. So, on a very personal level, in terms of personal boundaries. So, those are the types of things that with these superpowers you sometimes struggle with, but it also makes us very human. But yeah, absolutely. My story and what led me, perhaps, if you will, to the field of well-being, was my own experience with burnout in the workplace. And I will try to make it as brief as possible because it is not a brief story at all. But about 10 years ago, so I was with Deloitte for 23 years. So really, the majority of my adult life in various roles throughout the organization. And about 10 years ago, when quite frankly, we weren't talking about this kind of stuff in the workplace, did workplaces have some benefits and tools and resources for you to take advantage of as an individual if you could find them and seek them out and find a way to take advantage of them? Absolutely. But nobody was talking about this, and so I was struggling for quite a long time. I knew I was struggling, but I was living and working in a very high performing organization. I'm a high performer. I'm a type A personality, and so I knew I was struggling, but I also just kind of had this mindset of like, I'll just continue to push through. I'll keep doing what I'm doing, and eventually it'll just go away because that's what we do. And it didn't go away. And other people pointed it out. Other people that cared about me, said, maybe there's something going on with you. Are you okay? And I was of the mindset, I'm going to tell them I'm fine. I'm not going to put down this wall that I have to let anybody know I'm just going to push harder. I'm just going to push harder, and then maybe they won't notice. None of those things work. If you were wondering, none of them work. And so that's what led me to burnout. Eventually, my body and brain said, all right, stupid, if you're not going to admit that there's something wrong, we're going to force you to admit it. And so, pretty much one day I woke up, I was alive, I could get out of bed and kind of make coffee for myself, but there was just this overwhelming recognition and feeling of the fact that I wasn't able to engage in my life or my work in any meaningful way, and that I was, failing at all of those things. And I really did process it as failure, which is something we can talk about because burnout isn't failure, but that's how those of us that are high performers process those things. And that I was failing in literally every aspect of my life, and at work, and in my relationships at home, and just in who I was and who I wanted to be. And so that was kind of the pivotal moment of, yeah, I actually do need to take a step back and take some time off from work. I was very fortunate to have an incredibly emotionally intelligent leader and mentor and supporter who was like, yeah, you absolutely need to do this do this for yourself. I've got your back, which I think a lot of people don't have. And as hard as it was for me to take that step back from work, knowing that I had someone that had my back, that literally was like, I've got you, just take the time you need. Certainly made it easier. Although I will say that at the time when she said that, I also processed that as failure. I was like, oh, this is just kind of my soft landing. She's not really I didn't see it until many years later that what she was doing by creating this space for me was probably one of the kindest, most emotionally intelligent things that anybody has ever done for me.
But
But I
Jen,
didn't see it in the
also
moment.
she valued you, right? She had worked with
She
you for
did.
a long
She,
time, and
she
so
saw potential in me that I didn't see in myself. Going back to what KeyAnna was saying earlier, was she saw something in me, and especially at that time, I didn't see it in myself. So absolutely. Fast forward, I took that time off, not to minimize it, but I did really focus on getting healthy and well, both mentally and physically, and that I think reignited or ignited this passion that I had had long in me, to focus on health and well-being, not just for myself, but for others. And, in the words of Ariana Huffington, really help other people recognize that burnout isn't the price or should not be the price that we pay for success. And how do we create workplaces, that don't, that don't celebrate that and don't reward that reward behaviors that are quite the opposite of that. And so I went back to work. I went back to that same leader, and I actually was like, I think I need to resign because thank you. You gave me the space and the grace and all the great things, but now I've decided that this is what I want to do, and this doesn't, this type of role doesn't exist at Deloitte. And once again, I think it was her vision, really more so than mine. And, talk about kind of feeling seen and feeling like you belong. She looked me straight in the eye and said, if you need this, there's a lot of other people that need it too. And I was like, whoa, okay. Now there's, not only does she have my back because she sees my potential, she just jumped into the arena with me. And the story goes later on that, I was able to help her with some of her own mental health struggles. And so things kind of came full circle. But that, she kind of sent me back on my way and said, I continue to hold this space for you. I have your back, but now you need to put together a business case for what this looks like at Deloitte. And so I spent a couple of months doing that. And interestingly, at the time, and thank goodness for organizations now like Workhuman and World Wellbeing Movement, but at the time there was no data on like high performance and well-being in the workplace. It was all sports teams. And so my entire body of research for my business case was on athletes and sports teams, and why things like rest and recovery are even more essential for the most elite, highest performing athletes. And how do we translate that into the world of work, albeit very different? It was something that tend to resonate, and I think still in many ways does resonate. But now we actually have, thankfully, the real data about workplaces. And so I put together that business case. I think I got very lucky because we had a head of HR, chief talent officer, and our incoming CEO. I'm just going to give her a shout out as Kathy Engelbert. For those of you that don't know who she is, she's the commissioner of the WNBA. It wasn't a hard sell, and I say that I got lucky because I think so many people in these roles today struggle with selling this, and why does it matter, and why is it not just another HR program, that we can bury under benefits and check the box and say that we're done with it. But I had, again, two leaders that were like, yeah, we get it. And so they said, what do you think we should do? And I was like, well, we need to do a bunch of pilots.
And
Coming from a management consulting background, the way to get anything done is doing a bunch of pilots.
absolutely, and research so that we actually know what really works versus maybe what's trendy. And I really want to get into that role, but before I do, because you've been so courageous in sharing, and there will be listeners right now who are experiencing symptoms of burnout. And I just wonder if you have any words of advice for those listeners.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things about burnout. I think the hardest thing about burnout is there are still so many people in the workplace today that question whether burnout is real. And I think part of that comes from the fact that we have started to use burnout as a big, broad category for anything related to, stress or work overwhelm or anything in kind of in that realm. And that's important, but I think there's a big difference between, well, there is a big difference between being stressed, chronically stressed, overwhelmed at work, being able to take some time off and feeling refreshed and recovered and able to kind of go back into that same environment and continue to perform and do your work, versus burnout or true burnout, where, taking a few days off or taking a few weeks of vacation doesn't fix the burnout. And so if you feel like you are stressed, chronically stressed, overwhelmed, trending towards burnout or burnt out, ask for help. Seek out help, whether it's with friends, family, colleagues, clinical help. I am a big proponent of therapy for literally everyone. Even if you think you don't need it, or especially if you think you don't need it, perhaps. But yeah, don't suffer in silence, because letting it, continuing to like kick the can down the road and power through it, that doesn't, unfortunately, that doesn't fix burnout. It actually just exacerbates it.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate that. And a lot of organisations now will have benefits where you can access free therapy. Some countries do. In the UK, on the NHS, you can get talking therapies. Other countries have different variations of it. It really, really is important to seek that professional support. I do want to move into your roles, and I might go back to you, KeyAnna, quickly. I mentioned at the beginning, I just love that the word human is in your job title and in your company. Tell me more. What is a Chief Human Experience Officer?
So there's a very practical, tactical answer to this question. And then there's the heart and feeling answer to this question. I like to think of myself as a creative pragmatist, so I always have to give you both. So one is I started this role about 18 months ago at where I joined Workhuman. And I came in and the team was called the Human Experience Team, but the role was the Chief Human Resources Officer. And I was like, that doesn't, what? And then as I got to know the people on the team, I was like, we are about the human experience. And if I'm going to be seen as any type of leader, I want to be seen as supporting that leading first with the human experience. Because if that's what we're doing inside of our organization, it's obviously going to permeate outside of our organization, within our product, into our clients, et cetera. So that's the practical reason. But I just love the idea of moving away from we have human resources or we have talent or all of these other names that we've come up with, and just say what we really care about is the human experience. And it takes the pragmatic forms of what's the benefits offering or what do we do around performance assessment? Yes, but it's also about our workplace experience team, right? And it's about how do we go about these things and not just the what. And I feel like that's been part of the conversation that people leaders have been trying to drive for at least the last 5 years, if not more, is we have to care just as much about the how as the what. And I think that's what's made room for well-being to be a topic. I think that's what's made room for this idea of recognition to move just beyond thanks and here's a $5 gift card. It's all of those things to say we care about the human working experience, which then means that you have a better human experience more broadly. So that for me was the pull and the drive, but also the opportunity to say this should be the title here, and this should be how we think about the work.
Yeah, here, here. And the sooner the resources is dropped out of the title, human resources, the better, I think we probably all feel. So Jen, you've shared your story of how you came to be, possibly the first Chief Wellbeing Officer. I can't find any evidence of a Chief Wellbeing Officer that predates you in that role, but certainly the person who put shape on what that role is. And many have followed in your steps. And actually we've had, I think, 2 or 3 Chief Wellbeing Officers on this podcast, which we've been really delighted to have. But can you tell me, if an organisation is hiring a Chief Wellbeing Officer, what are they looking for and what should that role actually do?
I think that that's such an important question, because I do think that in my experience, knowing many of the Chief Wellbeing Officer, the global heads of wellbeing, that there's still, first of all, there's still too few of us, but knowing many of them, I would say that there isn't a common definition or role description yet. I still think it is somewhat a little bit all over the place in terms of, what is the role, what is the responsibility, where does it, structurally kind of sit and report to. And so I don't want to get caught too much on the structure and where it reports to. What I will say, I think, is most important about the role is that, number one, the role and the person in the role has, broad visibility to all that's going on in the organization. If there are different business units, really having the ability to have a lens into the way that those different business units operate, what's important to them, kind of how business and how work gets done. Because there's no longer, maybe there never was, but there certainly is no longer a one size fits all when it comes to well-being. And so this idea that we're going to kind of roll out this well-being program and it's going to be the right fit and the right thing to solve everybody's well-being problems, and we can check that box and walk away, that's just not reality. I don't think it ever was, but there was a period of time that we convinced ourselves that it was. And so this person needs to be able to kind of have a broad perspective into all aspects of the organization. So they need to have a seat at the right tables so that they get this, this perspective. Obviously, I'm making the assumption that anybody in this role is going to be an expert in their field, just like, we wouldn't put somebody that has no financial experience into a CFO role, or no operational experience into a head of operations role. You obviously need to have the subject matter expertise, but beyond that, I think especially in these large organizations, you need to have a seat at the right table, and what the right table is could vary. But you need to be able to have access to the most senior leaders. You need to have a ability to gain broad perspective about the way that people in your organization work in the different business units and what matters to them. And then you need to be able to influence.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of the research backs up what you're saying. As you know, you wrote some of the research, but you look at the Gallup State of the Global Workplace report reports that workplace stress is higher than ever before. CIPD report that 1 in 8 employees are miserable. Sadly, the statistics go on and on. And there's also a lot of research now around the fact that actually the CFO should care, because if you can improve employee well-being, you can improve productivity, you can improve talent attraction, retention, financial and stock market returns. Now, I still argue you should be doing it because it's the right thing to do, and we have, we should have our colleagues' backs. But the CFO wants numbers, and those numbers, they do exist. KeyAnna, as sort of Chief Human Experience Officer, I believe you have a number of pillars, which you define as total well-being. Can you talk me through that?
Sure. So I love that Jen said well-being is the issue of right now and the future, because we agree at Workhuman, right? And I think both internally, but also for the research that we've done recently with Gallup, we've defined total well-being as 5 pillars. So there's career, there's social, there's financial, there's physical, and then there's community. And so with each of those pillars, you just said this as well, Sarah, there are financial implications here. So, okay, if we have to speak to the head and the heart, right? The head piece is that there is about a $20 million of opportunity that's lost for every 10,000 employees due to low well-being and its drain on performance. And I'll pause for a moment and just say, performance and productivity, we all tend to think we know what we mean by those words and we know what those right outputs are. But I think part of the challenge is post the height of the pandemic, we've needed to redefine and be a bit more flexible in what that looks like and what's the right setting for the right expectations. And so for me personally, I've always said, as I've come back into the working office space in this hybrid working environment, that productivity for me in the office means how many people have I had a face-to-face interaction with? And the happenstance of that is I maybe get to remove a 2-hour meeting from next week because I had a 20-minute conversation that gave me more than just, oh, I got the answer to this question or I moved this project along, but also helped me deepen a connection with another human being. And so when we think about all that you get from those interactions, and that productivity having a broader definition, you also need to think about the $322 billion in global turnover costs that happen because of this lost productivity, because people's well-being have been negatively impacted and nobody's pouring back into their cup. And so I think specifically hitting on that social piece, obviously working at Workhuman, we truly believe in the power of social recognition, but it's that beyond thanks piece, right? It's that idea of, by recognizing you, I'm saying I see you and I see you in these moments and I recognize you in these moments that, yes, could be the day-to-day expectations of your work. But a lot of times what we've even seen within our own culture is people recognizing other people for things like vulnerability, for things like creating those spaces where they feel like they could really show up, or making space for them because that day was really tough for them. And those are the moments that really help to dispel this idea that you should be working towards burnout, that we should be rewarding this idea of work until you drop. And so those are the moments that we get really excited about and we see that value come from, and we have all of the research to say that. But I would also share that recently internally we had a conversation led by our fitness center leader, around this idea of well-being and what that looks like. And we had 3 leaders participate, including myself. And I shared with the organization that only 3, maybe it's been 4 months now, I talked to my therapist, I reached out to my doctor, and I said, I think I need some sort of medication assistance with whatever is going on with my mental health. And it's because, to the point that Jen made earlier, this idea of your strengths can also be your weaknesses. I've always thought that one of my strengths is being able to see the prism, to be able to look at all of these different angles really quickly and say, okay, here's the list of options we should consider. Here are some of the pros and cons. Now let's dig into this together. But I realized that these thoughts were not shutting off, and that I was going to bed mentally exhausted because these thoughts were not shutting off. And I was waking up mentally exhausted because these thoughts did not shut off. And I was really nervous that by going on medication, that would ruin my superpower. I wouldn't have that power anymore. And I remember the first night that I took the medication and I woke up the next day and I texted my best friend and I said, it is really quiet in my head right now. It's kind of peaceful, but it's also a little bit terrifying. And she told me, yeah, that's the experience for a lot of people. That's more normal than what you had going on, but you can't know that until you reach out for help and you find that there can be a difference and an alternative. And in the last 4 months, I don't think it's affected my superpower. And I shared that with the organization. And again, similar to Jen, not that I'm looking for external validation, but I wanted to share that with folks because it's not an easy decision to make. It's not easy to say, I'm going to go and I'm going to have this conversation because it feels like in the society that we've built that you're admitting some sort of failure, that you can't just muscle through it on your own. And I received more acknowledgement both on and off of our platform from that conversation than I think I have for any of the work that I've done in the 18 months that I've been here. But it's things like that that make me go, I can do this. I can keep going no matter what's happening in the organization or external impacts that are happening that make me want to stay here, regardless of anything else. And the number of employees that I talk to that say those moments of recognition that are about who they are as human beings and how that has made somebody feel better or feel safe or feel more connected to their work really makes them want to stay here or stay in the organizations who have a similar program. And I think that that speaks volumes, maybe more so than the research itself, but certainly the research helps.
So, KeyAnna, first of all, thank you. And you've raised a really, really important topic because we always give that important advice of the importance of getting professional support. And before I kind of go to the next question, how are you feeling now, KeyAnna?
Yeah, I would say, you know, it's interesting. I talk about being authentic and I talk about vulnerability. And I think the hardest person to be vulnerable with is yourself sometimes. And so from the time that I started the medication, it took a lot for me to tell my husband that that was something I was going to do. And I think what surprised me most was he seemed sad, but he seemed sad because he didn't know that that was the place that I was in. And so he was almost caught off guard by it and felt like, I wish you felt like you could have told me, did you think I was going to judge you all these things? And so it's almost like after being together for 21 years, we're somehow closer than we've ever been. And I've been sharing with him along this journey of the medication of like, hey, I feel really good today. And I'm just saying that out loud because I don't think I've said that in a year. And so I think for me, how I'm doing is I'm okay. I still am a little bit nervous that like, what's this gonna do? And am I gonna pay some price on the other end? But I think that's just because of my background and how I was raised. It was, strong Black women, and we don't ask for help. We are the helpers. And therapy was not a big thing in my community. And the idea of going on medication was just like obscene. But as I've been on this journey, I've had these conversations with my mother, and she's in therapy now, which I thought would never happen. And she very much needs, but I've also seen a change in her. And I've been more open to, I can feel good and stress is not an indication of my worth. And that's just a whole different orientation. So it's only been a short period of time. I know many people have been on this journey much longer than I am. So I'll let you know if anything changes, but I don't know. Right now, I feel good.
And KeyAnna, you've also brought up the importance of talking to each other and asking how we are. I heard great advice, which is ask twice. So if you ask somebody, how are you? And they give you a stock answer, which will depend on what culture you're from. Some will say, fine. Some will say, not too bad. Some will say, good, thanks. Those are all stock answers. Ask again. No, how are you really? And what I've been hearing from both of you in this conversation is that importance of those people in our lives who are there for us and we're mutually there for them. But you also brought up recognition, which of course is core to your company's values, because Workhuman provides organisations with the software they need to enable peer recognition across the company. And Jen, I was really surprised to see some Deloitte research that said that 85% of people in the workplace, I think it was expect to get a thank you or feel disappointed if they don't get a thank you. Now, that research surprised me. Why isn't it 100%? Surely we all want to be thanked. But I guess the point I have here is it is a leadership skill. It's a leadership skill to ask, no, how are you really? And it's a leadership skill to remember to say thank you, because the amount of effort that our colleagues put into whatever project it is that they're working on. And there's ways of saying thank you which are authentic, which are genuine, which are specific for what we're thanking people for. So that's just one leadership skill. You said, if I'm quoting you correctly, well-being is an essential leadership skill. Can you tell me more about why it's so essential?
Yeah, absolutely. And for those that are looking for a way to dig deeper on the how are you, I ask, how are you sleeping? Um, because number one, no one's expecting to be asked that question. But number two, if I know how you're sleeping, oftentimes I will know how you're doing, and that gives you a lens to try to dig a little bit deeper. But I will say that some people will be like, "Why do you want to know how I'm sleeping? That's none of your business." So, but it's just a fun way to kind of tear down some of those walls. But I do believe that well-being is an essential leadership skill set. I think that for too long we have made it a nice to have, or perhaps not even a skill set at all. And we've made it something that, well-being is the responsibility of the individual. And if you take care of yourself, and you're feeling good and you show up and you're feeling good, and that, trickles down to your team and your colleagues and the people that you engage and interact with during the workday, then that's great. But if you don't, then that's your problem, and it's not the responsibility of me as your leader or of your organization to really do anything about this. And so, I think that that's absolutely wrong. I do think that there are skill sets within that fall under the umbrella, or said differently, there are things that we all do, and there's things that we all don't do, that's behaviors that significantly impact other people's well-being for the better or for the worse.
Yeah.
And so really understanding that, Sarah, you and I often talk about barriers. And so I think the best way to describe this is, we know that there, from the research, that there are the things that are creating bad well-being outcomes in the workplace are typically not, well, my company doesn't have a meditation app, and so therefore my well-being's bad.
Yeah.
Nobody's saying that. That's not in the research. Because everybody's smart enough to get a well-being app, get a meditation app if they want a meditation app. There's many that are actually for free, and so most people are saying, I don't need my organization to tell me that I need to meditate. As a matter of fact, sometimes that makes me feel worse. when I don't meditate, or when I don't have time to meditate, or when meditation or yoga, or pick your fate. I'm picking on meditation. I'm a meditator, so don't come at me. But people do not need their organizations to force these things on them as a way to say we care about your well-being. Now, I'm not saying that organizations should not invest in those things. They absolutely should. And this goes back to the conversation with leaders. Sarah, you mentioned the CFO. When I talk to CFOs and COOs, I say, you know what, you're incredibly well intentioned. Thank you so much for spending so much money on these programs, tools, and resources for your people. Let me teach you how you can actually maximize these investments. And so instead of them being this downstream reactive, like you're struggling with your mental health, here's a meditation app, we're teaching people at the outset, these are skills and activities and behaviors that we expect, that we reward, that we celebrate, and that can look different for everyone. And where I get to barriers, and this is kind of how I personalize it, not only for myself, but for others that come to me, all of us have behaviors that we probably have never stepped back and done a real audit of. Why do we do these behaviors? Am I a bottom? Like, what am I doing that is creating negative well-being or frustrating to my team, or something that my team wishes I did differently, or even better, something that my team wishes I did better, and they actually have suggestions for me on how to do it differently or how to do it better, but I've never had those conversations because I've always done it this way, or this is the way that the person before me did it, or this is the way that the organization has always did it, and we haven't stepped back to say, like, hey, work has changed so much. Why are we still doing it this way? Because we know that, perhaps we don't, perhaps we know, perhaps we still need to do the work to understand that a lot of the behaviors and the ways in which we're working and the things that we all do are actually creating negative well-being outcomes for people. So I'll give you a real, like, couple of real examples. So, are you a bottleneck? Like, are there things that that right now require your approval to get done every single time, but maybe they shouldn't? Like, why do you need to approve it? Is there someone else on your team that can approve it? Because it's an administrative burden. You're busy, everybody's busy, but the team always seems to be waiting on you to approve something in order for them to move forward. And you want to create trust and autonomy with your team, so you give those approval rights to one or two other people. Make sure you stay informed, but you don't have to be the ultimate approver of things. Right? I mean, I could go on about meetings, and why do we need all 10 people from our team on the same exact meeting or call when only 2 people or 3 people are actually talking, or are actually needed to make the decision, and everybody else just needs to be informed, right? So, like, why aren't we giving people permission to have JOMO instead of FOMO, right? Like, so there's so many things that JOMO is joy of missing out.
Thank you. I just wanted to confirm what JOMO is.
Yes. JOMO is joy of missing out instead of fear of missing out. But, like, recognizing that if you have 10 people from your team on the same call, what are you giving up? Like, what is the sunk cost of 10 people on the same call when only 3 people really need to be on it to make a decision, right? Are you really maximizing the value and the potential of the people on your team, or are you just doing it because this is the way we've always done it? That's what I mean by, we need to look at barriers that we're creating as individuals and as leaders, and then we can expand that out to, like, team barriers and organizational barriers. And I truly believe this is the way that we start to chip away at some of the systemic issues that are creating bad well-being outcomes, that then, if you put a meditation app in place, people actually can benefit from the meditation app and don't feel guilty for not using it.
Absolutely. Yeah. KeyAnna.
I would just love to add on to that if I can, Jen, because not to be that person, but again, the Workhuman platform, the recognition done right, allows you to build a culture of JOMO because you're getting the recognition in a way that
Absolutely.
matters to you. outside of needing to be the 10th person in that meeting, right? Like in some cultures that don't have this, it's the only way that people feel recognized is if they're a box on the screen or if they're seated at the table in the room, even if they're not adding anything. And so being able to recognize people more regularly, peer to peer, not just leader to direct report, it is one of those valuable tools of saying, I can recognize you. You don't have to be in these meetings. If we need your opinion, of course you'll be invited, but also we will bring this information back to you and make sure you have access to it. I am a huge proponent on my team of they will always check in with me and say, hey, do you want to be in that meeting? And I'm like, nope, you've got this.
Nope.
I trust you until you tell me that I can't trust you.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, this conversation is so important. Oh, and we've covered so much, and I could keep talking to you both for hours, but I want to kind of ask what you do in your day-to-day life to ensure that you're looking after your own self-care. What's your daily habit, your daily ritual?
So I realize that as you all have these beautiful, peaceful backgrounds, it looks like I'm coming to you from John Oliver's void during the pandemic. But what I'm actually looking at is the rest of my office that is set up, and not this part that isn't. And so what I have, and maybe at some point I can turn the camera and get a shot of it, is during the pandemic, I realized I want something that I don't have to think about doing that I can just do. And I got really into Lego sets, like little kids ones, sure, but also adult ones. And so I have a Lego set of a picture that can be hung of a wave that I built. I also have this very intricate puzzle of an art studio by one of my favorite artists, Basquiat. And when you turn the puzzle around and just look at the back, the pieces all come together to form Basquiat and all of his biggest things. But then on the front, it looks like his art studio. And around me at all times, out of the frame, I know this is bad visual podcasting, but when I first started this job, my boys were so excited because I was coming from a not great working environment and experience. And they were so hopeful for me. And so my oldest built me Wally, and my youngest built me Eve. And these have been on my desk every day. And I look at them and it just makes me go, okay, we've got something that we do together. I've got something that I do for myself. And it all feels like it's right and it's balanced and it's good.
Well, our audio listeners didn't get to see those beautiful Lego creations, but for those who are tuning in on YouTube, do you want to turn your camera so we can see all of those things?
I do. And I want to make sure that you can see it well. So we've got the wave, and that's all Legos. And then
That's
we've
amazing.
got the Basquiat puzzle here. And then I've also got on my desk. So this was a fake plant that one of my first managers ever got for me because I killed every plant in the office. And she's like, this one won't die. And I've had it for 10 years. And then I also have, can I zoom out here? This is a bird of paradise plant that is all Legos that I built as well. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
KeyAnna, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. Jen, same question to you. What's your self-care ritual?
Well, obviously books, because I am surrounded by them in my office on all sides and in most parts of my home too. But outside of my home office, my well-being, my own well-being framework is eat, move, sleep, and find joy. And so being mindful daily of how I'm fueling my body. That doesn't mean that I eat healthy all the time, but more often than not. However, I've been known to eat red velvet cake and black and white cookies and all the things. So there's room for that. Movement is really, really, really important to me. I find some movement every single day, whether it is in the gym or just going for a walk. We talked earlier about our mental health. I live with anxiety. And so for me, movement is one of the most important ways in which I am able to manage and help control my anxiety on a daily basis. So that's a non-negotiable, as is sleep. For anyone that knows me or that has watched my TED Talk, you know that I am known for the Gen exit, which has many other names too, but I do not negotiate away my sleep for anyone or anything. And it doesn't really matter who I'm with. When it's time for bed, I get up and leave. My husband will tell you that I have literally left him at parties and sent him a text and told him to find his own way home because I was going to sleep. And then I added find joy actually during the pandemic, but it still resonates today because I think if you spend too much time focused on the current events and the news cycle that never seems to quit, regardless of where in the world you are these days, that it sometimes is difficult to find joy, except the fact that it's all around us. You just have to seek it out, and oftentimes I find that as humans, we seek the bad for some reason, or the dramatic, or the contentious, as opposed to seeking the joy. And so whether it's, YouTube videos of puppies or calling a friend or looking at vacation photos, it could be reading a book, many, many, many things, but just being intentional about making sure that I'm seeking joy in my life and not succumbing to the negativity that feels like it's all around us sometimes and can consume us.
Well, I think that's the most perfect place to finish. A call to action for everybody listening to find a way to seek joy today, whether that's through Lego, through movement, through eating, socializing, human connection. Thank you both so much. This has been really the most incredible conversation, and thank you for bringing such bravery, such honesty, such authenticity to this conversation. Truly, I'm so grateful, and I'm sure our listeners will be too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.